I want to be as clear and concise as possible regarding the conflict in Iran. I won't talk through every historical detail, but I do want to lay a basic foundation for understanding. This issue is one of the most divisive among Trump's base. There are two major camps, each with sub-factions that land on the same side but for different reasons. Those opposed to the U.S. involvement typically fall into two groups. One believes this isn't our problem and should be handled by even our allies in the Middle Eastern countries. The other believes we're being dragged into a conflict that serves Israel's interests, not America's. The divide is even more glaring when we look at the pro-intervention crowd. Some, like Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, are openly calling for regime change. Others push for bombing Iran into submission without any clear exit strategy. What they all seem to agree on is Iran cannot be allowed to get nuclear weapons, supposedly because they'll destroy us. It's what they say after all. But North Korea and Pakistan, however, apparently get a pass, but I digress. I've said before, regime change has proven to be a disaster in the Middle East. Whether it's direct military involvement or funding allied forces and resistance groups, this strategy has led to endless war. If the mere possibility of a threat is enough to justify involvement, there's no end to the conflict. The truth is, regime change hasn't worked in the Middle East. Not in Iraq, not in Syria, not in Libya, not in Afghanistan. It creates power vacuums and breeds blowback. Now, some say that Iran is different culturally and therefore regime change could succeed. But this ignores history entirely. Iran was one of the earliest examples of failed U.S.-backed regime change in the region, and we're still dealing with the consequences today. In the 1950s, the U.S. and U.K. launched Operation Ajax, a CIA-backed coup to remove Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The official reason was to curb Soviet influence, but in reality, it was about oil and geopolitical control. Mossadegh had nationalized Iran's oil industry, which directly threatened British and American interests. The coup installed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, as a pro-Western autocrat. Yes, while it is true that his father used to rule over the region, he was installed as a CIA puppet. His regime was heavily supported by the U.S., both economically and militarily. Initially, there was a rise in westernization, but it came with brutal crackdowns and a growing resentment, particularly among religious folks in the area. Now remember, the central figure to the Iranian Revolution in the late 1970s is Ruhollah Khomeini. He didn't just emerge out of nowhere. His rise began in the 1960s when he became the leading voice of opposition against the Shah's White Revolution, a series of Western-backed modernization reforms heavily supported by the CIA. Now, Khomeini condemned these efforts as anti-Islamic and oppressive. As a result, he was arrested and eventually exiled, which only elevated his status and influence. He spent much of that exile in Iraq, of all places, where his message continued to spread. By the time the Iranian Revolution took shape in 1978, Khomeini had become the symbolic and literal leader of the movement. He returned to Iran in 1979 and became the country's first supreme leader. His rise and the revolution itself sent shockwaves through the entire region, igniting fears of more religious uprisings against Western-aligned regimes, further destabilizing the Middle East. And out of fear that more anti-Western uprisings will follow, the U.S.-backed Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980, kicking off the Iran-Iraq War. Yes, that's Saddam Hussein. But Saddam eventually became a threat himself, and the U.S. decided to go to war with him. First with the Gulf War in 1990 after he invaded Kuwait. Then in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq again, this time under the pretense of stopping weapons of mass destruction. Oh, how history repeats itself, because here we are yet again. All of this, decades of chaos, can be traced back to the 1950 1953 coup. And yet some still pretend Iran is a clean slate for regime change. Let's be honest. There's overwhelming historical evidence that regime change in the Middle East leads to chaos, blowback, and often even more repressive regimes that hate America even more than the previous one did. It's not speculation. It's what already happened.